Hello, my name is Sid Parker, and today I'm going to be asking the question, is land art real art? So, to begin, to kind of make my argument, first we have to determine, is nature art? And today I'm going to be trying to be defending the fact that nature is art. So, I guess we'll start off, nature is aesthetically pleasing. If you wanted to go the route, kind of like the religious take on it, you could say that there's like a higher being um, behind it. And you might counter that and say that perhaps art is only made by people. However, I have seen things made by animals or different species that have been put into museums. So, and I'm not trying to place somebody's deity on the level of an animal or anything like that, but for this argument, we're saying it doesn't matter if it's a human or other being who created it. Then it has its own form of standards and ways it can be judged, and I will kind of be getting into that here in just a moment, but I personally think that you can judge nature, and then lastly, it can make you feel an emotion. So, Alan Carlson. Now, Alan Carlson is an environmental philosopher here who kind of counters a bunch of different arguments made for um, kind of like the environmental approach to aesthetics here. But one of the first models that he kind of talks about here is the object of art model, which is appreciating the physical object without the environment. So, for example, that's kind of like taking a rock home and being able to admire that as a piece of artwork. And I kind of agree with what Alan Carlson says here, which is you lose the ability to really appreciate it because you're taking it out of the environment. Part of enjoying nature here is having it as like a whole picture. So to that extent, yeah, I do agree with that argument that he kind of makes here. He moves on to the second model, which is landscape or scenery model, which is appreciating nature as if it were a landscape. And he thinks that we lose the value of nature when we appreciate it like that. And to some extent, I do also agree with that point. Another thing Alan Carlson mentions in his own model is that knowing a little bit more about nature can really help you appreciate it. And I think by having like this sort of knowledge about nature, you don't have to kind of view it as a landscape, but you can find like this deeper meaning by having like this background knowledge about it. Like I can look at a tree and I don't have to enjoy like the composition of the tree. I can just be like, wow, that tree is really cool because it can use photosynthesis. That's pretty awesome. But alternatively, I feel like you also can view nature kind of aesthetically. There's again a lot of like a beautiful sunset or rows and rows of hills, and I think it's okay to be able to look at nature like that. Um, then the third kind of model he talks about is the human chauvinistic aesthetic, which is our appreciative responses to nature aren't really aesthetic at all. Um, and he kind of says we can't evaluate nature, and I'm going to get to here in a little bit about how I think perhaps you might be able to kind of judge and evaluate nature, but he goes into what is what is our response to nature if it's not one of an aesthetic appeal. And like I said before, I personally think you can view it as kind of aesthetic, but again, perhaps there might be some sort of deeper appreciation that goes beyond the aesthetic here as well. Um, then the last model he kind of talks about here is the aesthetics of engagement, which is you can only appreciate nature by immersing yourself into it. And he kind of counters that with, well, aesthetics imply some sort of like psychological distance. And the point, the problem that I personally think with that is I feel like there's also some sort of you have to immerse yourself. Like if you go to a museum and you see a painting, you are also immersed in that experience. Part of viewing that painting is being in the museum. Likewise, I feel like that can go for any art. Say, your grandma's fine china is artistic to you and holds some sort of artistic value. Well, part of viewing that fine china for you is um, the rosemary candles that your grandmother puts out in her house, and the dusty musty smell of the cabinet that the china is in. I think that's part of the experience. So with that, you also have to experience nature in nature, similar to you would art. So um, you might have some sort of more aesthetic value in getting some distance, but I don't wholeheartedly agree with that counter here. And then Carlson's own model is kind of just having like this appreciation of art and nature, but having like nature be its own separate thing. And I'm going to talk about here in a little bit why I think it's important that you actually view nature as art. So hear me out here. I know this is a little strange. My slide here, it says nature is more closely related to a form of stage art. And I think that when people ask the question like, oh, is nature art? They're thinking of it, again, kind of like in the landscape or scenery model. They're thinking of nature as like this picturesque painting. And I think it's a little more helpful to view it as more of like an experience. Again, I talked a lot about being in nature, but again, and something that I think has a little bit more of a closer relationship, in like at least in like an art form, is kind of like a stage art. So similar to like a theatrical performance, you can't take it home. The viewing experience is different each time. So every time you go out in nature, there's little minor things that are just different, similar to a play. And then visuals are a key component that goes for like your, I didn't mention it here, but again, that kind of, all your senses are really involved here. Your hearing, your sight, the smell, even. If you want to eat dirt, perhaps that can also be part of the experience. And then again, similar with a play, I feel like it's really hard to get the full experience if you can't see all of the play. Perhaps you have an obscured view in the theater that you so chose to watch the performance at, or something along that nature. Again, like a play, I think having all your senses, and that's not to disparage people who perhaps may not have all of the senses. I feel like you can still enjoy things, but I think like the peak experience is being able to have all of your senses satisfied. And then there are skills involved, and you might be asking yourself, what kind of skills does nature have? Hear me out. Since I've already made this big stretch of, well, nature is kind of like a theatrical play, I'm going to go ahead and say that there is some sort of skill to nature. Personally, I think like good art or good nature is nature that is thriving. And so to have like this thriving art, nature has spent a lot of time cultivating things that have survived. So Darwin has natural selection. So with this little kind of train of thought here, I think bad art or bad nature is, again, things that are just not thriving. So personally, I think there's some sort of skill to that. There's that fight for survival. That is a skill to me. And again, you might ask yourself, well, what about like the rocks and like the abiotic components here? And so I really kind of had to dig deep for this, so bear with me here. But I think like the coming together of ions and molecules is like kind of like a skill. I guess you would say like bad art in this sense here would be like radiation, or like ions and molecules that did not go down the path of least resistance here. So again, nature has kind of cultivated like this perfect viewing experience through like ages of like this competitive survival here, and I think that's a skill. So again, good art is nature that is thriving. Bad art, as you can see from the deforestation here, that is the art that is not doing so hot. And so that leads me into why these are not art. So you've got the Dubai Islands, you've got Mount Rushmore, the surrounded islands, which was like this island where they put like this, I think it was polyester fabric to surround the island. Personally, this is kind of like less offensive because it wasn't permanent, but it was kind of obstructive while it was up. The spiral jetty and those dumb rock towers that people put on the hiking trails. I don't know if you've ever seen them, but it's like 5 or 6 rocks just stacked up on top of each other. And hopefully you might have already been able to connect the dots as to why I personally do not think these should be considered art. But again, it causes nature to not thrive, and so you're basically like ruining your painting here. So for example, I'm going to talk about the Dubai Islands. So the Dubai Islands are incredibly disruptive to nature because there's like a reduction of shore aquatic life. There's buried and asphyxiated wildlife. So you see all the sand here that's sitting on top of coral reefs, and that is harming and killing the coral reefs beneath it. You have increased turbidity, which is like the sand that gets kicked up, makes the water murky, and that's really hard for primary producers that rely on the sunlight coming through the water. And then changed alongshore sediment transport. Again, kind of like the flow of nutrients here in the water is kind of being disrupted by like this shore sediment, which has like a new shape to it. So qualities that I personally think do not make land art art. So if it's intended to be a permanent structure, up until that point where nature again is thriving. So if you have something ugly there that's disrupting nature, but eventually like moss or something covers it, and then nature can continue to thrive. Up until that point, it's not art. It's a negative impact to the already existing art. If it causes disruptions to the environment, it's not art. Again, I'm equating it to like lighting a painting on fire. You're already destroying the art that's currently existing. And if it ruins the aesthetic appeal of nature it's in, again, that's like throwing mud on a beautiful, lavish painting here. That's what I'm equating it to. And so what I didn't really describe, as I'm running out of time here, but it's important to view nature as art, because otherwise it becomes like this kind of background thing in our lives. I think by putting this, because art is so important to our culture and our lives, and I think by being able to place this emphasis on nature, it will really enhance our experience with nature. So hopefully this all made sense. I'm just going to talk a little bit about windmills. Personally, I think they're a net positive, but that's up to you and your own opinions, of course. But here are my works cited, and I really want to thank you for listening to me today.